Now, though, we go from Columbus's journey, and in many instances it was kind of even a failed journey on his own part. And while he's credited for discovering America to establish, there have been people here for many thousands of years, and he really didn't discover anything. So that's also something to consider is, what does discovery mean, and in what way did he really discover anything? He can't discover something that's already, people were already living there. And so, trying to get to what happens next, we're going to see other Spanish explorers coming down. We have Cortez in Mexico. And so this is Mexico City is what was formerly Tenochtitlan. And so we see Cortez in Mexico confronting the Aztec Empire and colonizing there. And then also from Spain we have Pizarro coming down to Peru. And that is where the Incan Empire had stretched about 3,000 miles, which is a big span of time, 3,000 miles from about one to the U.S. So, all right, so we have Cortez and Pizarro's conquest of the Aztec in Mexico and the Incans in Peru, and further. So, in the 1520s, Cortez first came to the Aztec Empire, and just going to give a kind of quick overview of the kind of general occurrences on both ends, on both. So basically, history kind of repeated itself with Pizarro in Peru, and so in both cases, Cortez and Pizarro came to these lands and discovered impressive empires. So both of his men. Pizarro's, usually under just a couple hundred men that would come over, and in that they were both very impressed with the empires that they encountered there. So it seems surprising considering how outnumbered they were and how impressive and powerful and strong and large these empires of the Aztec and the Incans were, that they'd be able to defeat them. And so, kind of as a quick explanation, I would look to Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel to really summarize his thesis and all of his points. Will be a little exhaustive in this, so I'll do my best to just give a really kind of cursory overview of that. And so, basically, Jared Diamond and texts like People's History of the World would argue that the Spanish conquistadors basically defeated these powerful empires as accidental warriors. It was a happenstance of a stream of good luck and kind of undeserved advantages that were the result of geographic advantages. So in Europe, throughout the Middle Ages, there was the plagues and the Black Death and all these other diseases that wiped out a large portion of the European population. And these diseases are born out of domesticated animals, which the Aztecs and the Incans didn't have contact with. The Incans had llamas. The llamas don't carry the same diseases as pigs and cows and all that. So what happened was that over the years, Europeans were building up a resistance with each generation. You build up the antibodies and resistance to those diseases. And so they carried with them diseases that they had built up a resistance to lands that had no exposure to these type of diseases. And we'll see that too with the colonization of the America that we know of, the United States of North America. And so, rewinding back, the argument is that the Europeans, so the Spaniards came with kind of a stacked arsenal, one that was born out of geographic advantages, and Jared Diamond would argue that those advantages that helped them really win this conquest, if you want to call it winning, that enabled them to defeat against really any likelihood or probable odds, was this arsenal of guns, germs, and steel. So about 90 to 95% of most of the native populations that European conquistadors and conquerors came up against, they annihilated virtually by by accident, by manner of these invisible germs that they carried with them. And so that significantly helps the spread of their conquest and settlement of these lands. But they also had guns and steel. And while guns were important, at that time they were slower, and the technology was, I mean, decent against the weaponry that they had, which did them fine for their conditions. So you don't you don't necessarily advance when there's no need to. And so the weapons that the Aztec and Incas had were more than satisfactory for their situation, but when they were met up against guns and steel, their weaponry just didn't stand much of a chance against the guns, germs, and steel of the Europeans. So specifically those steel, they had Spain had a really strong kind of metallurgy, and so their metalworking was particularly strong. They had really impressive swords. I guess the sword could be impressive at the time, and so that was one of the things in their arsenal that really kind of sealed the deal. So between guns, germs, and steel, that sealed the fate of the Aztec Empire, which ruled at the time by Montezuma, and the Incan Empire ruled at the time by Atahualpa. And so, for the most part, these couple hundred men came through and defeated in short amount of time large portions of these empires, which in our textbooks, meaning the textbooks that I come across in U.S. Classrooms, in U.S. world history classrooms, celebrate this as a triumph of, what was seen at the time as kind of God's plan, and showing that God was on their side. And so the competency theme we see throughout U.S. history and a lot of European history is seeing these things as confirmation that God's on their side. So I'm just going to review real fast with a little piece of the paper. We have, in Spain, we have Columbus sailing, trying to make his way all the way to the Indies, and landed in the Caribbean right here. Meeting the Tainos, treating them really poorly, enslaving them, instating that system of tribute for a period of time, and eventually also contributing to the transport of slaves from Africa, which, again, we're going to get into more detail in a second. We also have, in Spain, we have Cortez sailing to Mexico and defeating the Aztec Empire there. And then we also have, from Spain, traveling to Peru and the Incan Empire, which again stretched 3,000 miles, which, keep in mind, is the length, the width of the United States. And they defeated these in a relatively short amount of time. And with that came a new system of social organization. So the native inhabitants, like I was saying, about 90 to 95%, pretty much across the board, once they came in contact with the white man, with the European colonizers, about 90 to 95% of the populations died out. But of that did survive, they were originally forced into, they were the slave labor. There were rebellions though, and so especially when not in a foreign land, they were more easily able to flee or rebel, but on the whole they constituted a slave population in the bottom class. And what we see here is, I'm going to try to use this here to draw a little lecture. So we have the social class system in much of South America and in the Spanish colonies, at least, involve so as you can probably guess who was at the top. It was what's called peninsulares. And so this was the ruling class, and these were Spanish-born. Then we have the Creoles, and the Creoles and the Peninsulares make up the Oni class, and the Creoles were American-born, and by that meaning of what we now call the American So they were born in these lands, but they were descendants of Spain. So of European descent, but born in what they call the New World, which had existed for about as long as any of the world in Europe. So also another way in which textbooks create this kind of myth and mythology that this world didn't really exist, and it was just to diminish and undermine the existence of people and the nature by which they didn't really discover a land. And so by talking about it as the New World, it plays into that discovery narrative. So back to here, we have Peninsulares, Creoles, and then they're not made up the owning class. And then at the bottom, we have mestizos and mulattoes. Mestizos are the result of the mixing of races and so mulattoes were people of African and European descent, and mestizos were of Native American, kind of indigenous descent and European descent. And then at the bottom, we have slaves, and by that was made up of both African slaves and natives to that land. So I guess natives, indigenous. There's a lot of political nature of any term you use in that way, and so none of those terms are going to come without a political connotation and the ramifications of that. So that's the social class system that existed throughout the Spanish colonies, and so South America, Central America, Caribbean, we see a social class system based on race. And so that's not unlike our own experience, and we don't refer to it that way, but we don't talk about race in history or race in American history, or U.S. history, and both American history and U.S. history. But similarly, we had de jure and by law, basically a race-based social class system, arguably up until legal desegregation, and one could still argue, and I would still argue that today we have certainly a race-based social class system that is contradicted by laws, so our laws don't reflect actuality. And so while this shouldn't seem like a foreign system, this is what existed, and other models, other kind of parallels to this would exist throughout most of the colonized nations, whether we look at apartheid in South Africa or race-based class systems in the United States or so on. We can look at patterns of colonization and how the colonizers always put themselves at the top of the social class system because they're also outnumbered. So this triangle also shows kind of their numbers and their actual power. So they're actually small, and so when you're outnumbered like that in terms of social control, you have to set up rigid class systems to maintain that.